Live from beautiful Baja, Tustin, the International Film Studios, the McNeil International Film Studios. Today we're talking about GDP. Now, unfortunately, the whole world's on lockdown these days, and so we're not able to film before a live audience like we normally do. So I have attempted to compensate for this. So, do you want to hear about GDP? Yes? I consider that a mandate. All right. What is GDP? Gross Domestic Product. It is an attempt to measure the value of all final goods and services produced in the economy during some period of time, and normally it's 1 year. So first of all, when we talk about GDP, we have to decide, are we going to do real GDP or nominal? And in another video, we've talked about price changes and inflation and real and nominal GDP and how you convert nominal values to real values. So normally we're talking real GDP because we want to take the inflation out of these statistics. Final goods, not intermediate goods. I'll explain that in just a second. And normally it's for 1 year. There are three methods. It is unimaginably complicated to try and figure out how to measure the value of all of the goods and services produced in the economy in a year, especially an economy like ours that has, I think now, $21 trillion worth of, no, $19 trillion of real GDP. So they use three approaches. First is the expenditures approach, second is the incomes approach, and the third is the value-added approach. Now you may remember that in the last video we talked about the circular flow and that there was an identity, that the value of the goods produced must equal the value of the resources that come from the production of those goods. And so we can either measure GDP from spending on final goods and services produced by all of the different groups that spend, or we can look at all the incomes to the resource owners that are sold to produce all of the goods that are produced in the economy. The third method is called value added, and it's short and sweet. And in fact, this is a very valuable one, largely because the GDP statisticians have the best numbers, the most reliable numbers they can get this way using the value added approach. So value added measures, this value added approach measures the value that is added at each stage of the production process. And the sum of the value added must equal the value of the good at its point of final sale. And here is a very simple example. Right here. There's a tree in the forest. And the tree is cut down by a lumberjack. Obviously, it was a farm tree. This had no negative ecological impact. The tree is cut down by the lumberjack, and it is sold to the lumber mill for $300. The lumber mill slices it all up and cuts it into lumber and sells it for $400 to the woodmaker's shop that's going to use the wood to produce wooden things. And it gets sold for $400. The woodmaker turns it into a play set, a kid's play set that they the people put in their backyard and their kids play on. It's mostly made out of wood. So they create a play set and they sell it for $700 to a store called Play Sets Are Us. And for $700, then Play Sets Are Us sells it to a family for $1,000. So it ends up being a play set that is sold. So if you were to look at all the economic activity that took place in the production of this play set, well, there's the transaction 300, the transaction 400, 700, and 1,000. Would all of these added together be the value of economic activity or GDP this year? And the answer is no. If this is the only thing that took place in the economy, it's not all of these intermediate transactions that count. It's simply the value of the good produced. And in this economy, a play set was produced and its value was $1,000, and that's GDP. But it's very difficult to find out which sales are in fact final sales and which sales are intermediate sales. So if they can get the numbers, they'll try and find out how much value was added at each stage of the production process. So the lumberjack took 0 and turned it into $300. That person, the lumberjack, added $300 of value to this. The lumber mill took $300 worth of inputs and turned them into $400, sold it for $400. So the lumber mill added $100 of value to this thing. The woodmaker took $400 worth of inputs and turned it into $700, so that added $300 worth of value. And Playsets R Us, the retailer, took $700 of something and turned it into $1,000, so they also added $300 of value to this playset. And if we were to total up the value added, it adds up to $1,000, which is the value of the good produced. So this is value-added approach to calculating GDP. Incidentally, in Europe they have a value-added tax, and what that means is that at every stage in this production process, these transactions are taxed in Europe, and the VAT tax is about 20% or so. Anyway, the difference between intermediate transactions and final transactions. In order to be accurate in calculating the value of GDP, you have to make sure that you're getting the value of the final good, and you're leaving out any intermediate transactions in your final tally. Okay, the second way to calculate GDP is what is called the expenditures approach. And the expenditure approach simply says how much spending is going on. How much spending is going on. And who spends? Well, households spend on consumption. Businesses buy investment goods. So that's investment spending. Government spending is the big G. And net exports, foreigners spend as well. So the 4 types of spending are C, I, G, and net exports. These 4 things, you add them together and you get GDP. There are some subtotals and definitions to concern yourself with here. Consumption spending is done by households, that's the first thing, and it includes durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. A durable good is a good that is expected to last, I've seen different definitions, but the normal one is about 2 years or more. So cars and refrigerators and televisions and that sort of thing are durable goods. Non-durable goods are expected to last less than 2 years. So toothpaste and foods and perishables, and oddly enough, clothes. Now my clothes oftentimes, they should last more. But anyway, they're considered non-durables, clothing. And finally, services. Services have a definition. A transaction for which there is no tangible good exchange. Tangible means touchable. So examples of services would be entertainment services, internet services, design services, insurance services, educational services, psychiatric services, etc., etc. Unless the psychiatric services include pills or Xanax or something like that, which would be, anyway, that's not part of the service. Anyway, services, no tangible good. If you add these 3 things together, you end up with the total of consumption spending. Second is investment spending, and investment spending is gross, private, and domestic. Gross, private, and domestic. Gross versus net. You do recall the difference between gross investment and net investment? To get net investment, you take gross investment and you subtract depreciation. Depreciation means capital consumption, which means capital is consumed as you use it to produce things, and this gives you net investment. So gross minus depreciation equals net. So we're looking for net. We're looking for gross investment. Private, not government investment, and domestic, that is investment done in this country, not in some other country. And it includes fixed investment and inventory changes. Those 2 are the major categories, but within the fixed investment we have non-residential construction, equipment, and intellectual property. And then we have residential construction as well. These definitions are just used for GDP calculations, and they're different from the ones you may have learned about what investment is and so forth. It's very narrowly defined in the GDP accounts. Inventory changes. Inventory changes is what do you do with a good that is produced this year but not sold? It ends up in the inventory of the company that produced it. Well, there was no spending on it, so the GDP statisticians have to decide what to do with it. And so they assume that the business produced it and added to its inventory. They throw it into investment spending. Third category is government spending, and it's all government spending. But what's most interesting about government spending is how do you value the stuff the government buys? And the answer is they value it based on how much the government paid for it. And the reason is, if you go and buy a pack of chewing gum and you spend $1 for it, we know that somebody valued that chewing gum $1 worth. That's how they can use the price to show how much somebody valued a certain thing. But with government, oftentimes they don't go through markets this way. An aircraft carrier, what's the value? Nobody's buying it or judging it the way you would judge the value of a pack of gum. And so GDP statisticians simply value it at whatever the government paid for it. And finally, the fourth category is net exports. Net exports, that's X sub N, is equal to exports, that's why the big X, minus imports. And why? Well, U.S. exports represent sales, that is spending on goods produced in the United States, but the spending doesn't take place in this country because it's sent to some other country where the spending takes place. So those our exports count as a positive item in our GDP, and our imports are spending in this country on goods that were produced in somebody else's economy. So all of the imports coming in, it's spending here, but we have to subtract it from our GDP calculations. So exports minus imports. And when you add them all together, you end up with gross domestic product using the expenditures approach. Oh, so this is really getting to me. I may need in fact I do. I need a coffee break here. Excuse me, it's time to, Federico, we're going to make a cut here.